Ms. Kidston, in the introduction I gave this quotation about how you describe Cath Kidston as a joyful British brand. And another quotation from the website is that Cath Kidston prints are intertwined with British culture. Your company clearly prides itself on being a very British company, based on traditional designs and often rural designs. Where did the inspiration for this come from?
It feels like quite a long time ago now, because I started the business in 1993, and the inspiration had definitely come from over the years, really from when I was a small child, the very sort of English countryside background, that kind of thing. And I've got a strange sort of memory set in me that I can't remember a telephone number, I can't remember most useful facts, but I can remember prints, patterns and colour. It's like a kind of photographic memory for that sort of thing. So I can go back over my childhood and remember the spare room with lilac wallpaper, all this kind of stuff, the dress I had when I was a kid and so on. And when I started the business, it was a really, 1992, 93 was a really, really shifting time in that it was as the Conservatives were coming out, Tony Blair was coming in, there was a whole new feel of something new. And I had been working in interiors, working for, I had my own business for a bit, but before that I worked for an interior designer who did up these big kind of quite grand houses. And there was a really kind of formal, people aspired to living in, they wanted a dining room. They didn't want a live-in kitchen, sitting room. There was this kind of weird formal thing of, you know, houses being put back into period piece and everything like that. And I was in my early 30s, and I was thinking of my friends who were beginning to get married, have families, build their own lives. And none of them lived like that and aspired to live like that, or they all were sort of mixing a bit of old furniture they'd got with IKEA, with this or that. And I really liked the idea of bringing stuff in that was inexpensive and really working with, it's called vintage now, but it was like thrift shop stuff. There were all these house clearance shops, there were car boot sales, it was all that kind of thing. So it was a mixture of creative and commercial decision that I saw this opportunity in. There was so much stuff you could buy for really very little. So you could buy a table for £10 on the street and sell it for 40, and it was still less than it would be in a main store, and probably nice, and I like vintage stuff, it's unique and everything. So the business began with the vintage concept mixed with then bringing in my own fabrics, prints and so on. And it graduated from that. So it was based on nostalgia, but also kind of trying to twist that into something contemporary. So I was taking like old rose fabric and putting it onto plastic coating, so it became a tablecloth for kids. Or it's always that practical thing combined with creative. So I think it all stemmed from sort of past life and then how it came out.
As you noted just then, it sort of seemed to capture this national mood at the turn of the millennium, and now has become so stereotypically British that you have your shop in Piccadilly next to Fortnum's and shops across the world. Are you pleased that your designs have become so stereotypically English, I suppose?
I was very proud of how the business grew, and I was very proud to create something that was unique and could be recognised as a brand. And I think, and that I really hold on to. I love the fact that it's recognisable, and so often people come and say, oh, I know your name, your brand or whatever, and that I never expected. I started with one shop. I was amazed when it grew to 2, and it sort of organically built up. I mean, now it's a sort of complicated thing because I left the business in 2015. I'd worked there for 14 years or something, and it had become, it was big. It had 250 stores. It was a corporation then, with this very large business in Asia, bigger than here in Europe. And so I kind of didn't feel I was suited to be working in this big business that it started out, like a corner shop or whatever. So I left, stepped away from it all, and thought, well, this is the first time I haven't worked since I was 17, and I can go home, do things like go to exhibitions, cinema in the afternoon, all the things I dreamt of doing when I was working every day. And I was lucky, I duly did that. And for about 18 months, I remember seeing so much sky. You know, if you go to work every day, you aren't outdoors so much. And I remember noticing the weather and the seasons. I hadn't had that. You know, you kind of do have it, but not in the way that if you're not working, it was really weird. And then I was traveling. I went to India, which is one of my favorite places, and I saw something that triggered an idea. And I felt completely trapped because I had nowhere to take that idea. And I realized that all the things I love doing, so just using my eyes, being out and about, all came back to work and design and creative. And so it was like a sort of trap I'd fallen into, that I couldn't work. My name had gone because I'd owned the business, and obviously when the business sold, if someone says, "Are you Cath Kidston?" I never know quite whether to say. So, well, I'm one of them, you know, I'm not all of them, but I'm one. And so I thought, well, I really want to start again and start designing and having an outlet to be creative. So now, for the last 5 years, I've had a small print studio. Was based in West London and then based at home when we were all locked up, still a bit at home. And I designed for other brands. And I love it because I get briefs or different things from companies, and it's a challenge and always an amazing journey, creating things that fit into their brand. And so I've done all sorts of things like I've done quite a lot of work with Japanese company Uniqlo, which is an ongoing thing, and I love their ethos, and I was lucky to work in Japan a lot in my CK days, and they have an amazing aesthetic and attention to detail. And so that's been a long-term project which has been really interesting. And then I design a bank and portfolio of product, and we share it with other companies. So it's sort of always weird going back to my old business with great pride, but being away from it and thinking now I'm very much in the sort of, today I've been working on something new which is all being launched, and it's like, so it's sort of a different period, but maybe not as interesting. But it's always interesting to talk about the kind of start of a business and how it all kind of evolved. And anyway, whatever anyone is interested to ask me.
And it was through your new business that you got the opportunity to design some clothes for His Royal Highness Prince George?
No, it wasn't actually, because I think he probably wore something from the Cath Kidston brand. I see. And I think that was probably when I wasn't there. But very nice for them, and I'm sure they sold everything, you know, and double or whatever. Isn't it amazing, the power of when celebrities and famous people and royalty wear something, how there's this buzz of halo around the brand, and it's extraordinary how people react to things like that.
Do you
nice
miss
for the brands.
Sorry. Do you miss your connection to the company at all, or are you enamoured with your new business?
I like my new business because it's sort of going back to my roots, and it's very free and it's very easy to work like that in the sense creatively. And so if you have a brand, you have to be very careful to keep everything within that brand when you work with it, which is exciting and can be really good creatively because there's a discipline in that. But then for me now, having done that for a long time, it's very exciting to go. I mean, I started out, as I said, doing interiors, and I'm very interested in home and homeware and things. And that's a very different look and feel, the stuff I'm involved with. And it's quite exciting to me that, because I'd researched a lot of that over the years, you know, in my 20s, and I was involved in all of that, and working with antique textiles, you know, seriously kind of old, not proper, you know, really antiquities and things. So I'm really interested to go back to my roots in that respect. So creatively, it's wonderful to have a new opportunity. I do miss some of the camaraderie. I had amazing people who worked with me for a very long time, and the friendships and all of that. When I had supper on Monday with my old CEO, Jo, who's the most lovely woman, and we worked together for over a decade. And we had so much catching up to do of, all the people, what's happened to them. That's the nice side of a company where you have the social aspect.
You mentioned earlier that when you stepped down from your job at Cath Kidston, it was the first time you hadn't worked since you were 17. So in many ways you had a very traditional upbringing in sort of rural England. And yet by 17 you were living in London doing various jobs. How did this come about?
I think my parents were very traditional in the sense of very old-fashioned. Well, my mother in particular. And I don't think it's really amazing when I look back. I don't think she believed in girls being educated. She thought that they should, get a job, keep busy, earn some money, get married. And I would never have been able to go to an academic university. I'm quite dyslexic, but I think I did go for a brief period to art college. I'd been working for a few years, then I went through foundation. And I found it very difficult actually going back to college having earned money, because it's like you have to kind of step backwards and all of that. But it's really bizarre when I look back. My brothers both went to university and were encouraged to do so. Neither of my sister or I. And so I'd always loved, when I was a small kid, I would make a shop at home. I was the really annoying child who made the tray and tried to sell it to my parents and their friends. And then I kind of got more sophisticated how I did that, and I thought, I'll make a shop and I'll go and see them when they've had a drink or two, and they're more likely to buy more. So my marketing techniques increased. And I was always making stuff, craft things and trying to sell them. So there was something in me from a small child that liked trading, making and trading. And so it was very natural for me when I came to London, which seemed a natural choice when I left school at 17, was to work in a shop, because I could do the windows, all the things that actually I could naturally do quite well. And so I had quite a long period in amongst jobs like dog walking and whatever, like lots of really random jobs. But I worked for quite a long time in retail. And later I found that really useful, because to see things close to the kind of customer thing and understand customer service, all that side of a business, was really helpful. If you're going to get into retail, thinking about the bigger piece and all the different departments. I did things like window display. I was reminded this week for Laura Ashley. It was so cool then, because Laura Ashley in those days were really popular. You got free dresses when you did the window. So I think I was naturally drawn to retail. And I never planned to have a career. I thought I'd get married. That's what my life was planned out to do. But when I was 25 or thereabouts, I got a job with this interior designer who's an amazing man. He's old now, adorable person called Nicholas Haslam, who's a very famous society decorator. And he has this extraordinary knack. A lot of people who work for him have gone on to do something, extraordinary things. I was very lucky. He told me that I was talented. And isn't that an amazing thing? I mean, you find here when you're talking, to your tutors or whatever, when people encourage you, and it's not everyone who does that. And he really helped me to believe in myself, and also to discover that work was far more interesting than being a housewife. This could be really, it became really the motivator for me. I loved it. And after a few years of working for him, I set up my own design company. And then I went on to found Cath Kidston. But it was really from him. I honestly think he gave me the boost to believe in myself. It's fantastic, that.
I assure you my tutors do not tell me I'm talented.
You have to say to them, if you want me to do really well, you've got to tell me I'm clever, clever.
You sort of preempted my next couple of questions, but I'll ask it anyway, because it sort of, I think, specifies it down a bit more. Was there a moment when you were starting off in London where you realised that you wanted to be a designer professionally rather than just sort of pursue it as a hobby? Was there a particular conversation you had with your former employer?
No, I was always racking my brains of what I could do beyond working in a shop. And I used to really dread that thing if someone said, what do you do, what are you interested in doing? And thinking, what do I say? I hadn't got a plan. And so I spent a lot of time worrying and thinking about, shall I be a picture frame? It was always creative things, going through a list of things of where I could try and focus on things. And the interiors thing fell in. I worked for an antique textile dealer who dealt in Oriental textiles, and I only got the job because a friend had worked there and she left. And she said, there's a space going at this place. Amazing gallery. And it really fascinated me, the journey of textiles and how, all the kind of, you might find a floral lining in a Russian coat, or you'll find, the way all the textiles traveled around the world. So I'd begun to get very interested specifically in textile. Then I got this job working in the interiors market, which it took me a couple of years to get. So I was doing other jobs while I went round trying to get in to a good studio. And so I had a plan to do interiors. And when I I carried on doing that and really liked doing it. And then when I founded the Cath Kidston business, I funded it by working as an interior designer for the first 5 years. So it was quite hard work because I was working, going to see clients, doing all of that. And then at the weekend, I would go to the car boot sales and stuff and buy my stock, or vintage markets. So it was kind of lots going on, but it funded the way. And then I got bored with, it became much more interesting to design product than to design rooms at that time. And so I kind of moved into that.
As you just described, naturally. Your first sort of foray into your own independent company was when you set up your shop in London that you've since described as a sort of glorified junk shop. Yeah. Have you found it interesting or surprising that in the last few decades there's been a massive sort of take-up in the number of people trading in vintage clothing and vintage clothing markets and second-hand and reused clothes? Or do you think this is always a sort of missing opportunity for creatives? And
I think, when I grew up, like when I was 16, 17, it was a hip thing to do, to go and buy like these old print dresses and bits. And I have an elder sister, and there was a lady who made these amazing dresses out of vintage fabrics all stitched together. So it was a sort of natural thing of that period to look for stuff. But I think I can only hope that this whole recycling now, it's moved from sort of vintage, decorative bits into actually thinking about recycling, reusing, buying vintage, and the whole kind of bigger spectrum of that. It's really becoming mainstream, isn't it? And I'm much more kind of interested in how is fashion going to survive? I mean, how can fashion houses keep bringing out endless new collections and this need to kind of drive a very hungry, but I don't know who's going to consume all that stuff in the end. It's really interesting, I think, how is design going to adapt and change, and how quickly. It is beginning to, quite quickly, but not enough, of thinking about what the opportunities are for all of that. It's super interesting.
I suppose those issues become more prevalent as a company becomes a global sort of conglomerate. Did you ever expect that your company would, your sort of little shop in London would grow into a international chain, or is it sort of quite bizarre thinking back for the journey that took your company from a shop in London to 250 across the world?
It is quite bizarre, the beginning bit, and I remember really distinctly opening the second shop and thinking with that I probably overstepped the mark, that I was really like, this is a bit like 2 shops is kind of insane. But then it got to a point where I think it was the 5th shop, when I had some investors come in, and I could feel the interest, and I could feel the sense that there was something, the business there was a stability to it, and what can be termed legs, it could grow and it could carry on. And I really felt that when it got to that stage, that there was a sort of way that it could expand that was really tangible and very exciting. And so the period from about year 5 for that next decade, it was the most extraordinary journey, incredible, of sort of things like when, Nokia around saying, okay, do you want to make the first, before we had phone cases, printed phones, or the things, doing the stuff with Marie Curie. That was a huge project of like making 5 million bags or something. You're like, what? But it was actually incredibly exciting, that part of the journey. was great.
Do you think such a journey would be possible for a small company nowadays, given the importance of online marketing and the dominance of international conglomerates?
I think the opportunities now are probably greater than they've been for a long time, because there's such an interest in new original things, and it's harder to be original and to be disruptive and creative, but there's a huge appetite for that, away from big conglomerates and all of that, naturally, I think. And with online and the way social media operates and everything, that it's easier in a way. In my day, it was the only way you could get known was if you had press in something, if you were written up about something, or word of mouth. And that was it. And I called the business my name so people could look me up in the telephone book. Because, you had this big telephone book, you probably do, you had to literally, or you rang 192 or whatever and asked for the number. It's so weird. That makes me feel like ancient. But that's what was happening in 1993. And so, but I think now with opportunities, I mean, I'm starting something new that's launching next year. And I've been working on this brand for 2 years and really developing, doing things. So the challenges now are how to create a brand that truly is sustainable, in this case has the right organic properties, is made locally, so in the UK. So the restrictions that we put on ourselves, which feel healthy and appropriate, are challenging to meet, and they're really important in this instance for me, for the values we want to do to meet. So there are limitations that one didn't think of maybe 15 years ago. I remember moving all the manufacturing of my business out to Asia and having put off doing it for a very long time because we couldn't get the manufacturing physically done with what we were making in the UK. And I took the choice of doing that because of protecting jobs. And we increased, I thought if we grow the warehouse, we grow the call centre, we have more shops. And it was all about creating jobs. Because in the early 90s, when the business began, there had been a very big recession. And a lot of people had been really out of work for quite a period, late 80s, early 90s or whatever. So in my mind, protecting people when we were growing with their jobs, that's why that decision was made. But now, you'll probably never make that decision. It's a different world, different responsibilities and so on.
I suppose to take a step back from looking at the journey itself and why you wanted to continue with it. You've said in previous interviews that your mother was a very large inspiration and motivation for you wanting to set up your first store and then invest more into it and see where it would take you. Why was this? What role did your parents play?
It's true. My parents, my dad died quite suddenly. He had a brain tumour and he died. He'd just turned 50, so he was young and it was very unexpected. And my mum, who, as I said, was a very traditional housewife, and he had taken this role of, running the accounts at home, organising everything. He was the kind of dominant, practical person in their relationship. And he died with unexpectedly very little money. He had inherited a lot of money from his dad when he was a child. His father had died when he was very little, and I think everyone thought he was very wealthy. I was brought up in this very comfortable way. And when he died, there was actually very little money. He had debt, and he hadn't told anybody. And so my mum, I remember thinking, whatever happens to me, I never want to be vulnerable in the way that she was. So that lesson taught me an enormous amount. And then she turned out to be the most extraordinary woman that she began. I remember she lived in mid-Wales. She began cooking at home. And she sold all that she'd had a cook at the house, and she'd never learnt how to cook. She taught herself how to cook, and she had this market stall. And she was amazing. She was such an incredible... And so she funded herself, not just through the market stall. She did, in the end, get support. But her attitude was so incredible of, I'm going to do this is what I can learn to do. And I just think that vulnerability as a woman of thinking, I'd like to be independent. I'd like to be able to make my own decisions as well. I think the fear, and seeing the fear around everybody after my father died, was unbelievably motivating, actually. You can imagine that situation. And so it's a very sad period. It was incredibly helpful to me.
Do you think it changed how you went on to run the company? I mean, for a while, it was one of the largest companies in the world that didn't run with any debt whatsoever. Do you think that part of that is this aversion to any form of vulnerability?
Yeah, that's the way I ran it. I would always have a business with no debt, and because of my history. And I'm really interested in the bottom line. I'm not the kind of person who, from the word go, when I began my business, I paid for an accountant to do my petty cash because I know that I don't have the interest in it. I'm really interested in the profit and loss, the margins. Give me everything else, and I can do a fraction mentally. I've got a very good mind for things like working out percentages and all of that, but I'm not interested in the detail. And so for me, it was really important, this thing of ensuring that basically you can see more coming in than out. And it's like as simple as that, which is not, and sometimes I looked at all those kind of big dramas in the city and everything that happens, and did they think about in and out, at the bottom, what does it all boil down to? What's underneath it all? And so I have a very simplistic brain, but it bore me in good stead for a long time.
It seemed to work.
I thought it was good. Yeah.
So looking back at how your company went global, there are obviously dozens of shops now across the world, and as you mentioned earlier, especially in East Asia. You opened in Japan and Korea in the noughties, and then in China in the last decade. Why do you think there has been such international demand for Cath Kidston products? And you said as well with your new venture in Japan with Uniqlo.
I think that there's something about the very English handwriting that appeals to people in that part of the world. When I had the one shop, and it was really a very tiny business, my first wholesale customers were from Japan. And it just, I don't know why it was, but there was something, I think, that resonated emotionally with them and with what they were buying. And it's been, an incredible journey, all of that. I do understand Japanese culture now much more, a lot, because I spent a lot of time there. But I think there's something, when a product has an emotional connection, and it could be your telephone, it could be whatever it is that we have an emotional connection to, that's the root of a brand, isn't it? To have its own unique emotional connection. And I think that's what the product had.
There's obviously sort of sometimes a flip side with something going as global as your business did. Do you ever go to parts of the world and see your products and just wish you could escape it all? Or has it not been sort of...
There was a time when it was a real problem for the business because there were so many fakes. And you'll go to certain areas where there are fake markets. And it was literally like, oh my Lord, this is a sea of fake. But that happens to any big brand, doesn't it? But I have to say, always felt, the best feeling in the world was when you saw someone walking down the street and they had a bag or something. It's an incredibly proud thing, that,
Sounds fantastic. One more question from me before we hand over to our audience. But what's next? Will you continue with your current sort of your work, or do you have any grand plans in mind?
I can't imagine not having an outlet for print. I've kind of come to terms with that, I think. I think my husband also hopes that I have an outlet for print, or I drive him nuts not having that kind of work thing going on. As I say, I've got my small studio, and we have these contracts that we do, which I really enjoy. I've got a brand launching, a new brand with a whole new thing, small English brand, next spring. And so obviously can't talk about that now, but I'm super excited. I've been doing all the kind of stuff for it in the last couple of weeks of the marketing, and it's come round. It's been a project all through lockdown, which has been an amazing thing. And so I'm very excited about that. And it does feel like I'm going back to my roots. It's amazing, that sort of thing. I'm now at the stage where I'm thinking, I think it will mainly be online because that's the nature of business. But it's like designing the website, designing everything. I really want to be arranging the shelf. I'm not going to get to do that, I don't think, anymore. But that's where I'm at my happiest, when I'm doing, I used to spend hours doing my own window display when I had the first shop. till midnight, in and out the door, looking at the window display. So I'm really like a kid in a sweet shop with retail. So I love having this outlet. I have to be careful. I think pretty much every entrepreneur, not to overwork. And I would say yes to things, and I should learn to say no to more. And that's about sort of workload, really, and how much I do. But it's still, I think if something's in your bones, it's very hard to set it aside. That's my experience anyway. But the thing I would say is I feel so unbelievably lucky that my life could have taken two directions. And I could be this sort of granny at home now, planning my whatever. And actually, I've had this extraordinary journey. I've met the most amazing people. I've been incredibly fortunate to create a brand that people recognize and all of that. And it's been, it's a roller coaster doing stuff like that. And there's been really good and bad times. But it's been extraordinary. And so anyone, when you leave college and you want to take a risk, it is a risk. But I wouldn't swap it for the world, what's happened.
Thank you very much, and now I'll hand over to the audience to take over from me. If you'd like to ask Ms. Kidston a question, please put your hand up. I will recognise you, and then Vedika will come and bring you the microphone. And please don't start asking your question until the microphone arrives. So if anyone has a question to ask, please raise your hand. The member here in the white coat.
What would you say your favourite ever print or design that you've created has been, and why is it your favourite?
There was a print which is, I suppose it's almost inevitable this, it was called Classic Rose. And it was a very clean print with big bunches of roses on white. I love prints that are on white. I was reading someone talking about that yesterday. There's nothing like a white-based print in my mind. And that came from, before I began the business, I found an old wallpaper in a cottage in Wales. It was a rundown cottage, and it wasn't locked up, it was empty. And they had this amazing old cabbage rose paper. And it really gave me the idea for starting the company. And so from sentimental value, the Classic Rose print from my brand of Cath Kidston would be my favourite. But I also have a thing that I love, all these antique prints that were done with copper plates that are very fine, like old quilt prints that are really tiny. A lot of them are black and white and geometric. And from a collector point of view, I love all these very delicate old copper plate prints. That's what I'm obsessed by at the moment anyway, all of them.
That's prompted a question I quite like to ask, which is, what's the strangest place you've found inspiration for print?
Gosh, there's so many things. Let me think about that. I bought flannels in the market in Egypt, which I've still got. They're really nice stripy flannels. I've bought the scene like fishermen's shirts in Kerala, when they're pulling all the fish out. It's on my travels, really. There's been so many different places. But I can't think offhand, I'm afraid, of the strangest. I know there's been lots, actually.
Are there any parts of the world you want to revisit to sort of gain more inspiration from? Any travels planned?
At the moment, I want to go to the ceramic museums in Holland and see. I love all the drawing and the painting on plates and ceramics and things. My sister's just done this tour there of going around all the museums in Delft and everything. So I've got that on my list. And I'm going to Greece next Friday, and there's a wonderful museum in Athens called the Banaki. Has anyone been to the traditional Banaki museum? Yeah, the textiles there are amazing. So if I can, I will go there. But there's always things to go and see, aren't there, everywhere? Yeah.
Fantastic. Please raise your hands again if you have any questions. The member in the yellow coat in the front row.
Thank you so much for your talk. I've got a question about branding and marketing, but to preface that, for the past 2 years I've been living and working in Japan, and I was so thrilled that one of the first conversations I had with my co-workers, who spoke very little English, was about my Cath Kidston rucksack and purse. And it was so just good. Amazing that I had something in common.
I love that.
I was in very rural Japan, and it surprised me that how great I can have this conversation sharing, an interest in the fabric and design and colours.
I'm so pleased about that.
Yeah.
I love it.
So my question is, do you have any advice for someone who is starting a creative business, a brand, on how you can work in that emotional route, the routing we need in branding, in both the brand design and marketing?
It really helps if you're true to yourself, isn't it, in what you're doing. If you try and, if something's kind of got integrity to it and authenticity, it's so much easier, I find. And if one's just trying to make decisions based on this sort of solely on the commercial outcome, it tends to thin things down. And so it's always that balance of stuff, but being brave in keeping committed to one's values and one's spirit. And if you're writing about your own brand, you have to do it in your own words, really, don't you? And it's really difficult to express it in that way. So I think if you try and focus on authenticity and be really careful to actually focus and not go too wide, it's normally the foundation of things. Does that help? Yeah. That's it. It's really, when I'm doing this right now, writing about this project that I know is so personal and so at the heart of everything that I like, and it's very hard to articulate what I'm trying to express in the end product. So it's sort of trial and error and going back to it. But there's normally a very tidy journey once one's resolved it. It's sort of quite edited.
I think it's like a vulnerability, at least for me at the moment, working out myself, what is that authentic picture I want to put forwards, which matches with my core values.
Yes.
And what I want it to resonate with other people. It's finding that point where it resonates, that emotional point.
But I think if one's really kind of rigorous about one's own values, that they are one's own values and what one really believes in, then it helps to be able to kind of almost write down. It's always, for me, it's writing down loads of lists of bits and think, this is important, this isn't, and this is actually a vulnerable thing that I need to sort out, and then work through. And then in that way, it's like with business plans and things, you begin to see if everything is valid and has got proper, if you've got the foundations in, it's easier, isn't it?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next question, please. The member here on the front row and in the black jacket is passed along. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's funny, I'm actually from Japan, and yeah, I can attest how big it is over there. My question is, do you have any particular process by which you produce a design? I mean, once you get the inspiration, how do you translate that into the actual product? I mean, do you, work around with colors a lot, like the pattern and size? I'm sure there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it really depends on the project. I've done some stuff recently where I was given very tight briefs, so it was like, please create stories around prints and patterns from a certain particular part of the world. So if you're doing a floral print, would you find that flower in that particular area? There's all this kind of storytelling before one begins. And that can be really interesting for research and a nice way to begin. Or it can be just researching, going through archive, museum stuff, thinking about mood and feel, and then starting by drawing. Nowadays, I think there's a tendency to work a lot on a computer, and in the studio that I have now, we all work with hand drawing to start. And whether it's hand drawn and scanned in or something, things tend to work that way. And also painting and scanning the stuff in and manipulating like that. Because I've really chosen to go back more to hand done things, just for what, and I'm very lucky to be able to do that because we're not in that pressurized commercial environment where there isn't time. And often stuff is just, redone in different ways. So drawing, quite a lot of pen and ink, and using very fine pens and things for doing things. But it does depend. If it's, then of course there's sort of, the thing I can't do and I need help for is pattern repeats. and how to technically fit everything. You know, we've just translated a print from a fabric to a wallpaper, and the wallpaper repeat is for a certain width and so on. So the guys in the team know how to step the pattern out to fit. And I'm like, should we try and make it look like this? And they're like, no, you can't, you know, whatever it is. So there's the technical side that I'm very limited with. And then the colours and the visual and all of that. So it's the hardest thing, I think, with design is editing and focusing and deciding what not to do. And usually a design starts very simply, gets more and more complicated, then gets stripped back to nothing. That's my process, which is probably a waste of time because it could have started very simple in the first place. But it's that sort of you work out, like, you know, does a pattern want a background or not? What is, you know, all the different options, how many screens, colours. It's mood and feel, but it's sort of technical versus. And again, eventually emotionally looking at it and thinking, does it have that feeling that one wants, which is quite hard to convey. Very hard. I should think in our studio, of the prints we develop, probably 1 in 20 get processed. And there's banks of stuff, but the ones we feel are really like how we want to go. It's really editing. Yeah.
Yep. The member in the grey coat at the back. Grey coat, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is kind of revolving about the recent developments in the fashion industry, especially around sort of automation. We hear a lot about sort of automated factories or even NFT. Will we see an NFT bearing your name, or would you think that's something you would think about getting into, maybe metaverse or stuff like that? Thank you so much.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably too old now with, you know, to get into whole new kind of things, but it's so interesting, isn't it, all the changes and how one adapts and things. I think I'm definitely open to, I mean, the automation thing, I feel really, I think that's really complicated, don't you, for kind of, it obviously is really incredible how technology has advanced and all the rest of it. And there's definitely a place for it. But at the end of the day, I don't know that scale of things. I mean, you know, when you see how a car is made or a pair of jeans or whatever, it's all going to be done that way. And it's literally just the way it's going to go. But there's a certain amount, so much stuff, which is, for me, with manufacturing, the people, the factories, the whole thing, it's that whole chain of how it had much more kind of, how can I put it? There's nothing like what a hand can do compared to, you know, when you end up with things. I'm not really making sense here, but what I mean is I still like the fact that there's this sort of human involvement in things. But I think, I don't know, I think I definitely feel quite old with all the changes that are coming on, and I'm really dependent on working with a whole younger generation of people, showing me and teaching me things. I mean, I'm like, some of the stuff I've been doing recently, it's changed in the last 2 years from when we started this new brand development thing. All the kind of production and things, it changes the whole time what we're able to do and what we can't do on an organic, on a sustainable, you know, the whole bit. So one's forever moving and trying to improve things. But it's definitely where I feel my age and feel I need kind of to work with other people. But I think we have to be open to all of this and open to being much more responsible and thinking about things completely in a different way. But for that, I really do feel the need to kind of work with rather than lead and that kind of thing. I just think I'm, you know, and I have people in my office who are in their 20s. They have so much more knowledge probably than a lot of people even in their 30s. about how developments are happening, and it's so fast. And I was reading this thing the other day I found really interesting. They're saying for businesses, governments, all sorts of things to be able to improve at the moment, we need to kind of flatten. You know how hierarchy, like you end up in a business with older people at the top and people coming up and all the rest of it. And we really need to embrace younger people with younger skills taking more responsibility quite fast within businesses. And I think a lot of tech companies have done this well. And very, obviously quite a few people are doing it. But the thing of changing this hierarchy, and you need kind of older heads for some things and their experience, but we do need to work with people who are learning in a totally different way. Does that make sense? It probably doesn't answer your question.
Yeah,
but it just shows
awesome.
that for me, I'm quite daunted by, really excited by positive changes, but daunted about how I am able to kind of get my head around it.
I think it's something that nobody knows the answer to. That the future is uncertain for everybody, but I think I'm very impressed about your sort of openness and attitude and sort of your ability to adapt and always evolve, but still carrying your very unique DNA and take on the world. And I'm a huge fan of your brand, by the way. Thank you so much for creating it and bringing it to all of us.
I had a follow-up question in regards to the manufacturing point. You clearly have a lot of sort of academic and historical interest in prints, in crafts and in designs. Do you think that with ever increased manufacturing and with lots of manufacturing being, as you said with your company, moved overseas and made for mass manufacturing, there's been a loss of knowledge and of traditional printmaking and textile making?
But it's just a bit like we're talking about progress. There has in some ways, yes. So if you look at like there was a beautiful exhibition the other day at the Textile Museum of like 18th century Dutch print and stuff that, all when things were made with these tiny hand blocks and copper plates and things, and all those skills, they've died out and you can't find that kind of thing. But there's been a huge resurgence in hand blocking, all this hand stuff is absolutely massive. But then digital print is also extraordinary. And all the 3D printing, all the stuff that's coming out, the change that digital has made and it's becoming increasingly good quality and amazing how it's done. And that has opened up. You'll see now, if you go into somewhere like Zara and you see a really big multicolour print, they would have probably made that in Italy with digital print. And it's incredible quality and it's mass produced. And you would never have had something with 20, 30 colours in it on the high street. You'd have had 8 or 10 screens at the most. And it's sort of, so there's these extraordinary things that progress. And I do have a sense that there's a lot of craft and small things coming back. There's people setting up. I was looking at this business the other day and it's all about handmade baskets. It's beautiful. And that wouldn't have existed 15 years ago, I don't think. So there's people who are able to sort of specialize in stuff. One, because the world wants newness and they're looking at these handmade baskets as newness and whatever. But two, because there's a sort of, so there's a market for it. But I think mass production is going to have a really hard time because we all want to know where something has been made, how it's been made. We need to be able to trace and understand to support a business. And I don't think you can get away with it anymore. And the ones that do won't for long. Because we can look into things, can't we? We can see. So that's going to really shift things. And yet there's still an appetite for very inexpensive things and obviously a need for it because of social economic conditions. So it's really a huge puzzle of how this will come out. I definitely think that the biggest thing that's going to come out of everything is how we reuse old. At the moment there's a lot of denim is appearing in the marketplace for a fortune, which is basically second-hand jeans. It's really expensive because they're second-hand. That's going to change. But it's all these things that are coming through. It's so interesting how that will come out. Exciting.
I think we have time for one more audience question. Yeah,
Hi, I'm just a bit curious about like how did you get the initial funding to found your business and to like get it run, and if you encountered any like financial strains during your business like running stage. And
Absolutely, I can tell you, after working for the interior designer, my interior designer job, I set up a small business in partnership with a friend, which specialised in antique fabrics, curtain poles, all of this and that. And from that I made a catalogue of new product that people could order. And the business wasn't hugely successful, but it was profitable. And so in '92 I sold my half of that business. That business I started with £5,000, which I had from when my aunt died. I sold the McKinney business that I had, and I got £15,000. And I was able in those days to fund Cath Kidston with that money, because I was buying my stock from car boot sales and junk. The rent was very low in that period. It was after the recession or whatever. I spent so much money on my rose wallpaper. That was 10% of my budget. And then I bought material from Eastern Europe, which was the second part of it. And I then, for the first 5 years, I made very little money from the shop. Gradually, each year the turnover doubled. But the first year, I think I sold £50,000 of stock, which was very little. But I was running my interior design business, and it paid for it. I was doing up this yacht. I would go to Malta once a month and do up this huge yacht for this man and doing all this work. Then I'd come back and do my business. So I sort of funded it like that to begin with. And then as the business took off and grew and it got to 5 shops, I brought investors in. And I sold a big chunk of it at that period because I felt I needed, very much back to my kind of education and everything, I kind of felt I needed business people in, that I wouldn't do it myself. And I brought people in. An American CEO came in who had a big retail background. And after a year, he nearly broke the business. It just went, it was so, like, I think this thing of wanting to expand it very quickly, he opened a store in New York, it just went boom, like this. And it took that year for me to realize that I actually understood it way more than I thought. And as it got into trouble, I was able to kind of feel, okay, I've got to fight for this and understand, and I can understand it a bit more. And the girl who was under him, who was the general manager, was amazing, this girl Jo. And she came in as the MD, and we worked together as a really very balanced team. So I actually credit her for half my success, because the two of us together formed a really good partnership. And I'd learnt, when I was growing up, something like the Laura Ashley business was a husband and wife team. And I think if you look at so many companies, there's more than one person behind them. And so I was always thinking, I've got to find someone. And the investors weren't actually the people. And lovely Jo, who was my general manager, we just worked so well together. She was really good at the petty cash, and I was really good with the ideas and this kind of thing in between us. So I was very lucky that I landed with her, I reckon. But that's how the funding began.
yeah, that was very interesting. Thank you.
One final question for me before we wrap up, and it's a question we ask all of our speakers at the end of their address, which is, if you can, in 1 or 2 sentences, what piece of advice would you give for our members here today for the next week, the next year, for the rest of their lives? General piece of advice.
I would say take risks, but make sure they're educated risks. You're in the right place. but be brave and take risks, because I think you don't want to be my age and regret not having taken them. Yep.
Well, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Cath Kidston for her talk today.